Started her writing career at age 5 with a protest letter to Milton Bradley. She was upset about the lack of female representation in board games. I guess the little pink pegs in life, not enough, didn't make the cut. Today she is a freelance writer, media producer, and educator. As a Fulbright-National Geographic Digital Storytelling Fellow, she traveled throughout Mexico collecting the stories of Los Niños de Morelia, a group of child refugees who fled the Spanish Civil War and settled in Mexico in 1937. Destry is working to learn more and communicate more about the lives of child refugees, both historically and in the present. Please welcome Destry Maria Sibley.
Asking you to use your imaginations. I want you to imagine that you live in a particular country, a democracy, but a democracy in decline. This is a country that's become incredibly politically polarized between the left and the right, that is marked by vast income inequality, where the rich are getting richer and richer, and everyone else is finding it harder to make ends meet. As a result, the wealthy are able to pour their money into politics, buying political favor. People feel like elected officials are ineffectual at best, cynical and self-interested at worst. People feel like their government's not working for them, and that in general their country is moving in the wrong direction. So, you can imagine living in this country. This is Spain in the 1930s. So stay with me. Imagine you live there and your country has a routine election, and the Progressive Party wins. But the outcome is anything but ordinary because within 3 months of the election, a small group of military generals organizes a coup to overthrow your democracy. And the elected party in office is so caught off guard by this that they hesitate in the first crucial 48 hours of the coup, a hesitation that will cost them and you your democracy for the next 40 years. Before you know it, your country is engulfed in full-blown civil war. And it's hard to know exactly what's happening because the news reports are unreliable, but you know that the cost of heating oil has become prohibitively expensive, and it's getting harder and harder to feed your family. And then the bombings start. You hear the sirens, and you have to run, grab your kids, get to the nearest shelter, wait out the attack, hope for the best, emerge to see how your city and your home has been decimated. So when you start to see news and hear announcements and propaganda advertising a program free of charge to send your kids out of the war zone, you consider it. It means that they'll be far away and you won't get to see them, but you're promised that they'll be safe and well cared for, and most of all, that this will be a short stay. So you do. You sign them up, you put them on a boat, and you ship them off to Mexico. This actually happened. In 1937, nearly 500 Spanish children were evacuated from Spain to save them from the Spanish Civil War. They were sponsored by the Mexican government, and their stay in Mexico was meant to be temporary, just until the end of the war, when the Spanish Republic would surely win back its democracy. But that's not what happened. Franco won the war, and Spain was thrown into a decades-long dictatorship. And then World War II happened. That's Franco and Hitler gleefully shaking hands. By the time that war was over, the children were grown and assimilated into Mexican culture, so most of them didn't return to Spain for 40, 50, or 60 years, and the vast majority never saw their parents again. This is a true story, but one little known outside of Mexico. The only reason I know it is because my grandmother was one of these children. As far as I'm to understand, the youngest, at just 3 when she made the trip across the Atlantic. These days, my grandmother has Alzheimer's, and in the past few years, I've watched her change. From being casually forgetful to not knowing who I am. It was around the time that I realized how bad her dementia was going to get, that I realized I had to act fast if I was going to truly capture her life story, the story of a life marked by the major historical events of the 20th century. So I started interviewing her and recording those conversations. I'm an audio journalist and podcast producer. That was a natural fit for me. But the more that I talked to her, the more questions I had, and the more complicated the story got. And so it became clear that if I was really going to understand this story, I had to go to Mexico. And that's where National Geographic and Fulbright came in. So I did. I went, and this research took me all across the country to sites of historical relevance to the trajectory of these children. It took me to monuments and murals and memorials. It took me to archives, both formal and informal. It took me to people's kitchen counters, where I got to see their scrapbooks and family albums. But most importantly, it took me to meet the remaining members of this group, now elderly, all between the ages of 85 and 95. And I got to record their oral histories too. And they really had stories to share. They told me about saying goodbye to their parents and setting off across the Atlantic on their own for the first time. They told me about being just children themselves and being made responsible for the care of their younger siblings. They told me about going to live in a boarding school in Morelia, the town that gave them their name, and the school principal who hated Spanish people. They told me about being made to go live in a convent with Catholic nuns or a different school or a foster home, and how in this move they were forced to separate from their younger siblings, and how that forced separation recreated for them the trauma of the first separation from their parents. They told me about setting off on their own, running away from school when they were teenagers to be independent, and how often they were homeless and hungry, didn't have clothes, were thrown in prison for walking around barefoot, or found jobs in bakeries like these or other kinds of businesses where they were often seen as just cheap labor. The few who were able to return to Spain after the war told me about how hard and hungry and scary a time it was in that country. My grandmother was one of the few who was able to go back, and she told me that when she arrived on her parents' doorstep, her father said to her, "Why did you come? Now we just have one more mouth to feed." And they also told me about the rare cases where they were able to bring their parents from Spain to Mexico after the war. And they told me about how emotional and loving and moving those reunions were, and also how weird, because their parents were strangers now. They didn't know them anymore, and the children were different too. Babies who had been sent away were now grown, were teenagers or young adults. And so they also told me about the weddings that happened in rapid succession after their parents' arrival, because marriage was the only socially acceptable way for them to be on their own again. And they told me about the kids who didn't make it. The children were sent from Spain to Mexico to survive the war, but not all of the children survived Mexico. They told me about kids who were electrocuted, who drowned, who fell ill, and who were crushed under the weight of a fallen chest of drawers, ages 7, 8, 11, and 12. They had a lot of stories. And at this point, you might be thinking, this all sounds really depressing, really bleak. But if you notice, you don't look depressed, you look pretty happy. And that's true. It was actually an incredibly joyful and hopeful experience to hear their stories. And I want to make it clear why that was the case. There were a few reasons. One is that I got to become an unexpected messenger between these remaining members of this group. They're also elderly now that they don't get to leave the house much, and they certainly don't get to see each other. So I got to go from home to home, bringing each other their stories, showing them their most recent photos, and giving them their family updates, and they really loved that. Something else happened, but to tell you this part, I have to tell you something hard and personal about myself, and so bear with me. A week before I was slated to leave for Mexico, I got a really hard phone call that my dear friend, Jafet Robles, had been murdered. And so I entered Mexico in a state of total grief and shock. And my whole time there took on a different tone. Every conversation and every interview had a different question, which was, how do we go through the hardest possible things and then keep going? But it turns out there's no one better to teach us about human resilience than a group of people who have gone through the worst possible things as children and gone on to live incredibly happy and lovely and long lives. So here's what they taught me about perseverance. They taught me that we only get through hard things together. These are people who grew up together and then watched each other get married. They became godparents to each other's children. They became neighbors and housemates, travel companions, and business partners. This is all just a long way of saying that in lieu of their families of origin in Spain, they became each other's chosen family in Mexico. They got together every year for reunions without fail, and when they did, they marched together just as they had as children in formation. They sang the songs of their childhood. They recited the same chants because that's what family does. It brings us back to our childhood. And they extended the same treatment to me. The very first person I met from this community, the very first time I met him, referred to me as his niece. And it also extended beyond family to nationhood, because these are people between countries, both of Spain and Mexico, but also of neither. And so they said that more than belonging to Spain or Mexico, they really belonged to the tribe that was the Niños de Morelia. But that's only true because they stuck together. The other thing they taught me is that we get through hard things by really looking at what's happened to us and then figuring out ways to tell stories about those hard moments that are stories of resilience, of perseverance and survival. Each of these people could have told me a story of their life that was the story of abandonment by parents or country, but that's not the story that I heard from them. Instead, they were stories about how they were made stronger by these experiences. My great aunt, my grandmother's sister, was famous for responding to any hard moment by saying, well, we lost more in the war. The message was clear: we survived worse once, we'll survive again. The last thing that was hopeful was that I had a glimpse into the future by talking to these people about their past. Because by looking back at the past of these now elderly child refugees, I had a vision of what could be possible for the millions of children who have been rendered refugees and asylees and been separated from their parents in our own time. And I can tell you that their futures do not have to be hopeless and they don't have to be bleak. And I know that's true because of the stories of these people, like Miguel, who went on in Mexico to become an incredibly successful businessman and then built a school there to give back to the country what the country had given to him. Or Florentino, because when I showed his wife this picture that I had taken of him, she still turned to him and said, "You're so handsome." Or Maria, who didn't go back to Spain until she was in her 60s. But when she did, she fell madly in love with an Andalusian and embarked on a passionate 20-year love affair. And then, in her 80s, she discovered another great love of her life, her love of painting. So today, in her room, in her assisted living facility, the walls are a gallery lined with her artwork. These are futures that these people could not have predicted when they were children, but because of their lives, I can now predict them for the children of our time. But that's only true if we as a people and our governments choose to do right by them. I could not have predicted that the year I spent researching the lifelong impact of family separation during childhood, my government would decide to separate children from their parents. Couldn't have predicted it. Never would have wanted to. But I can predict that those children will have to live with the legacy of that decision in their minds and their bodies, their psyches, their neurobiology, long after most of us will have forgotten that it ever happened. And I know that because that's also true for these folks. I can't think of a better way to try to make that truth be known than by sharing their stories with you. So right now I'm hard at work crafting their oral histories into a bilingual podcast series. I'm going to release it in English and Spanish so that everybody will be able to hear it and understand it. And if you want to follow along to get updates or subscribe and find out when it's going to come out, you can go to this website. That's the URL. You can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. It's not ready yet because I'm really working hard to make sure I do right by these stories. But when it is ready, I know you're going to want to hear them. Thank you.